Hello everyone, welcome to 10-Minute Physiology. In today's video, I'm going to give you a short introduction as to how sodium is handled along the length of the nephron. So with that, let's give it a go. So I'd like to begin by first giving you some introductory information. So the kidney is incredibly important in regulating the volume of our extracellular fluid. And the kidneys are going to regulate the volume of our extracellular fluid by regulating the amount of sodium that goes into the urine. Now, sodium salts are the most important contributors to the osmolality of the extracellular fluid, and the most important sodium salt is sodium chloride. So by regulating sodium chloride, we regulate the osmolality of our extracellular fluid. And as a general rule of thumb, wherever the sodium goes, water is going to go too. Now, in addition to this, the grand majority of the filtered load of sodium is going to be reabsorbed by the nephron. So around 99.6% of all filtered sodium is going to be reabsorbed by the nephron, and only 0.4% of filtered sodium will reach the pelvis. So that is the introductory material that I want you to understand. So with that, let's now talk about how sodium is handled along the length of the nephron. So the first thing that I want to do is draw a picture of a nephron. So this is a picture of a nephron. Now this picture isn't to scale and it's not anatomically accurate, but this picture of the nephron will do good for this video. So the first region of the nephron that I want you to focus on is going to be this region. Now this region is called Bowman's capsule, and inside of the space of Bowman's capsule, we have a network of capillaries called the glomerulus. So what happens is that blood flows through the capillaries in the glomerulus, and then filtration takes place. So filtration is basically a process where you have fluid and solutes moving out of the capillaries into another space. So in this case, fluid and solutes will move out of the capillaries of the glomerulus and move into the space within Bowman's capsule. So the fluid and solutes will then move out of Bowman's capsule and flow into the nephron. And as they go along the length of the nephron, the filtrate will then be processed by the cells. Certain things will be reabsorbed, while other things will be secreted into the filtrate. So now let's talk about how sodium is handled along the length of the nephron. So the first segment that the sodium is going to encounter is going to be the proximal tubule. So the proximal tubule starts at this purple line on our diagram, and it goes all the way to this purple line. Now the proximal tubule is going to receive all of the sodium that was filtered out of the capillaries of the glomerulus. So that's what this 100% sodium represents. So the 100% sodium basically represents all of the sodium that was filtered out of the glomerulus and moved into the nephron. So all of this sodium is now going to flow into the proximal tubule. So when the sodium flows with the filtrate into the proximal tubule is going to reabsorb some of that sodium, and it's responsible for reabsorbing around 67% of all filtered sodium. So of all the sodium that was filtered out of the capillaries and moved into the nephron, around 2/3 of that sodium is going to be reabsorbed by the proximal tubule. So the proximal tubule is responsible for reabsorbing the greatest amount of filtered sodium. So after the fluid passes through the proximal tubule, it will go into the loop of Henle. Now the first limb of the loop of Henle is going to be the thin descending limb of Henle. So the thin descending limb of Henle goes from this blue line to this blue line right here. Now the thin descending limb of Henle is going to be impermeable to sodium. So as a result of this, there is zero sodium reabsorption that takes place in this segment of the loop of Henle. And this is once again because the thin descending limb of Henle is highly permeable to water, but impermeable to salt. So no sodium reabsorption takes place in the thin descending limb of Henle. So the next region is the thin ascending limb of Henle. Now the thin ascending limb of Henle is not present in every single type of nephron. The thin ascending limb of Henle is only present in the juxtamedullary nephrons. So these are the nephrons that basically dive deep into the kidney. You're not really going to find a thin ascending limb of Henle in a cortical nephron. However, the thin ascending limb of Henle is going to be permeable to sodium, and there is going to be some sodium reabsorption that takes place in this particular part of the loop of Henle. However, in this video, we're going to ignore the sodium reabsorption that takes place here, and we'll talk about it more in a video where we focus on how sodium is reabsorbed in the loop of Henle. So we're going to ignore the thin ascending limb of Henle. So the most important part for sodium reabsorption in the loop of Henle is going to be the thick ascending limb of Henle. So the thick ascending limb of Henle starts from this green line and goes to this green line on our diagram here. So the thick ascending limb of Henle is going to be responsible for reabsorbing 25% of filtered sodium. So of all the sodium that flows from the glomerulus through the nephron, 25% of that filtered sodium is going to be reabsorbed by the thick ascending limb of Henle. So after the thick ascending limb of Henle, the sodium in the filtrate is basically going to move through the next three segments of the nephron. The first one is going to be the distal convoluted tubule, or the DCT. The second one is going to be the connecting tubule, or the CNT. The third is going to be the initial collecting tubule, or ICT. And then the fourth is going to be the cortical collecting duct. So all four of these segments are going to collectively reabsorb around 5% of the filtered sodium. So this then brings us in the final two segments of the nephron. So the first segment is going to be the outer medullary collecting duct, and there is no sodium reabsorption that takes place here. And then the final region is going to be the inner medullary collecting duct. Now, the inner medullary collecting duct is going to be responsible for reabsorbing around 3% of filtered sodium. So by the time the filtrate goes out of the inner medullary collecting duct and towards the pelvis, only around 0.4% of filtered sodium remains in the filtrate. The remaining amount of sodium, which is 99.6%, has been reabsorbed. So once again, 99.6% of filtered sodium is going to be reabsorbed by the nephron. So now let's summarize what we learned by showing which regions reabsorbed sodium and how much of the filtered sodium was reabsorbed by those segments. So let's draw a table with three columns. The first column is the amount of sodium entering into a particular segment. The second column tells you what the segment name is. And the third is going to tell you the amount of filtered sodium that is reabsorbed in that segment. So let's take a look. So the first segment that the sodium is going to encounter is going to be the proximal tubule. So the proximal tubule is going to reabsorb around 67% of all filtered sodium. So after the fluid goes through the proximal tubule, the filtrate will then enter into the loop of Henle. And remember that the first segment that it's going to encounter is going to be the thin descending limb of Henle. Now, as we talked about, there is no sodium reabsorption that takes place in the thin descending limb of Henle. Now, after the thin descending limb of Henle, it goes into the thin ascending limb of Henle, if it is a juxtamedullary nephron. If it's not a juxtamedullary nephron, then there is no thin ascending limb of Henle. However, after this segment, if it is a juxtamedullary nephron and we have a thin ascending limb of Henle, it will go into the thick ascending limb of Henle. Now, the thick ascending limb of Henle is going to receive a certain amount of sodium. After the filtrate passed through the proximal tubule, only 33% of the sodium that was filtered out of the glomerulus remains in the filtrate. So this remaining 33% goes through the thick ascending limb of Henle, and the thick ascending limb of Henle is going to reabsorb 25% of all filtered sodium. So as a result of this, after the filtrate passes through the thick ascending limb of Henle, we're only left with 8% of the filtered sodium that was filtered out of the glomerulus. So this remaining 8% will then go through the four segments here, and these four segments collectively reabsorb 5% of the filtered sodium. So this then brings down the amount of sodium in the filtrate to around 3%. So 3% of the filtrate that entered into the tubules is now remaining in the tubules. So the remaining 3% will then flow through the intermedullary collecting duct, and the intermedullary collecting duct will basically reabsorb the grand majority of that, leaving only a very small amount left behind in the filtrate. So when all is said and done, the filtrate is only going to have around 0.4% of the sodium that was initially filtered into the filtrate that passed through the nephron. So the grand majority of sodium is going to be reabsorbed by the nephron. So the last thing that I want to tackle for this video is going to be a view of what the future videos are going to talk about. So in this playlist, we're going to talk about a lot of different things. So the first things that we're going to talk about in this playlist are going to be how sodium chloride is reabsorbed in the different segments of the nephron. So we're going to talk about how sodium chloride is reabsorbed in the proximal tubule, how it's reabsorbed in the loop of Henle, how it's reabsorbed in the distal convoluted tubule, and how it's reabsorbed in the collecting ducts. We're also going to have a video on glomerular tubular balance. We're also going to have videos on the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, AVP and ANP. We're going to have a video on how the sympathetic nervous system regulates sodium chloride reabsorption. And we're going to have a video on the mechanisms that decrease sodium chloride reabsorption. So we're going to have videos on all of these individual topics in this playlist. So I hope this video helped you understand how sodium is reabsorbed along the length of the nephron, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.